Hello, welcome to Shaka Extra Time, a show appearing only here on Facebook Live, and the only place where you get to ask questions about what the current issues and what's happening on the continent. I am Paul Ndiho, and here today is Jackson Mvunganyi, my colleague, the host of Africa Upfront. Welcome to Shaka Extra Time.
Thank you, Paul. I must say, to echo the words of the great Shaka Sali, I'm humbled and exceedingly humbled to be here with you today. Thank you very much for having me.
Welcome to the show. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
A warm welcome to you, all our Facebook followers are watching us live. Shaka Extra Time is a place where I get to talk to Shaka himself. Unfortunately today, Shaka is out and Jackson is filling in for Shaka. So, Jackson, welcome again to the show.
Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to a good conversation. Hopefully, you know, we can tackle some of the issues that are happening on the continent. It's hard to fill the shoes of the great Shaka Sali once again, but we'll try.
Well, you're a great guy, Jackson. Let's start in your home country, Rwanda.
Yes.
What's going on in Rwanda?
Lots of stories happening. Last week, I believe, the major story was that Victoria Ingabire, an opposition leader, Victoria Ingabire, and 2,000 other people were released. Ingabire had been in jail, I believe, since 2010. She had been sentenced to 15 years in jail. She was pardoned by the president of Rwanda, Paul Kagame. Again, there were 2,000 other people, but hers was much more significant given her profile as an opposition leader.
Why now? Of all things that are happening in the world, how come President Kagame decided to give these guys maybe a second chance or a second lease on life?
I don't know. I mean, countries have, you know, reasons why they do things they do, political decisions they make at some point. It was expected that Victoria Ingabire and others who have been in jail for many years would be released. I figure somebody texted me from Uganda recently and said, "Was it the Chagulanyi effect? Is it possible that some of the events that are happening across in Uganda and other parts of Africa are spurring the kind of changes we see, including in Rwanda?" Somebody else told me it's possible that part of the reasoning behind this release was that Rwanda is trying to be the head to take over the leadership of the La Francophonie, an organization that brings together all these Francophone countries, and that it's quite possible that part of showing goodwill or that you know, there's a political reform happening in the country, that this move was necessary. It's also possible there was some sort of pressure happening from the countries that constitute the La Francophonie to show again some sort of goodwill to institute some political reforms in the country, and this probably is the right time.
How come the person who has been dominating the news on the political front, I'm talking about Diane Rwigara, is not a part of the deal?
That's a good question. That's a good question. It's possible that's just because, I don't know whether she has been sentenced yet. It's possible that she's, I guess that process is still ongoing in the courts of law. I don't know whether she has been sentenced and appealed. If she does go through the motions and she's sentenced, then it will be right to ask that question, is she also going to be pardoned by the president?
Let's go back to Victoria Ingabire. What makes her really stand out? She's been at the forefront of politics in Rwanda, but there's something remarkable about her. There are certain things that she's done over the past couple of years that make her stand out. Why particularly her?
You know, I think partly if anybody who goes to jail for their convictions, you know, political convictions, they deserve credit for that. She was, I think, in the news a lot because she was a woman who was taking on a very huge task, running against President Kagame, a very popular president in the country. She, I guess, was very outspoken, and she was not scared to speak out. And that's the reason why she ended up in jail. What happens after, we don't know. It seems to me that when she was released, she struck a certain tone of defiance when she was released, even though she was released at the mercy of the president's presidential commutation, that you felt that there's a little bit of defiance in her tone, in the way she spoke, and to the reporters after she got out, asking that the president, pardons all the other people, thanking her party members for having continued with the struggle, the movement, calling for reforms in Rwanda. So, regardless of whether you agree with her, her politics, you have to give it up to her for having the courage to having stood up and run. Anybody who does that, I think, deserves credit.
Earlier you talked about the Bobi Wine effect in
the
Uganda.
Chagulani effect.
Yes. Could that be something that...
I don't know. I don't
because
know.
If that was the case, then we'd be talking about Diana Rwigara, not
again, maybe the time is not right. Maybe the time is not right. Again, is the Chagulani effect the real thing that is spreading around the continent? I don't know yet. That's we'll tell with time. It's kind of a little too early to tell, to make the judgment that, Bobi Wine is having that kind of profound effect around the continent, where there's a seismic shift in the politics of the continent, where leaders are starting to be a little worried about opening up political space.
People who know President Kagame, they say that he's a guy who is very, very strategic. He's a strategic thinker, right, and somebody who knows how to tap into the PR machinery. Could this be a PR move, maybe disguising something major that is about to happen?
I mean, again, one of the major things that is about to happen in Rwanda is that Rwanda is very likely to head the La Francophonie, which is very big. It's major.
The last time I checked, they are part of the Commonwealth. They're no longer part of the Francophonie.
But they want to be everywhere. There's nothing limiting them to think big, to dream big. I think Rwanda does things differently than other countries around the continent. Okay,
let's cross over. Let's talk about maybe go to Southern Africa. Some interesting news coming out of South Africa, right, especially with the legalization of cannabis.
Absolutely. South Africa has always been very progressive with their laws. We know the LGBT, one of the first countries to recognize the rights of people, LGBT community. Right now, the Constitutional Court just passed a law legalizing marijuana for personal use. I feel like that's a very good move on the part of the South African government, at least in terms of having to deal with other major issues that are happening in the country. I mean, the country is one of the, people say crime-ridden, has one of the highest rates of crime on the continent, if not in the world. Taking out marijuana from the equation, I think, frees up some of those resources, police resources, to deal with other bigger issues.
But one could argue that there are a lot of things at stake. Why legalize marijuana? Because everybody has access to it. It's something that you find almost everywhere on the street.
Absolutely, but then there's a lot of people who are in jail right now in South Africa, who are being arrested every day for using marijuana. And so if you take that again out of the equation, it makes it easier for them to deal with other issues that are much more pressing. Marijuana probably was not that as a pressing issue, and the fact that the Constitutional Court looked at it and said that we need to get rid of this and legalize it, I feel that that is a very good issue. Sorry, that's a very good move on their part.
But is that going to stop, for example, South Africa is considered one, when you go to some of the cities like Johannesburg, is considered like the #1 murder capital in the world. So does that mean...
I don't think marijuana causes people to murder.
Well, you're going to have a lot of people who are smoking joints on the streets.
That's a misconception. That's a misconception. I feel, honestly, on my part, it is long overdue. These are some of those issues that are kind of take away focus from the bigger issues that are happening. That if you're the murder capital, maybe you should commit more resources to solving the murders than going after somebody who is smoking a joint on the street, smoking weed. You know what I'm saying? So I feel like this is a very good use of resources, and I feel like the country has gotten to that point.
Before we go to the comments, let's maybe talk a little bit about corruption. Most recently, the son of Equatorial Guinea's President Teodoro Obiang
yes.
Jr. This is, by the way, his father took over power in 1979 after overthrowing his uncle.
They own that country. They've been owning that country for over half a century. No, for over a century now. No, for over almost 50 years now.
So when you think about it, these are guys. This is a guy who's always, I think, is full of controversy. Every time you read about him, there is a corruption scandal. Most recently, he was part of his entourage was arrested in Brazil with $15 million.
Well, I had $16 million with a lot of watches and jewelry. You know, it's so sad to see that, you know, potentially one of the most richest countries in the world is being run by a family that is unabashed in the way they plunder the resources of the country. Somebody was saying that if you divided the resources of amongst the citizens, because how many are there? About less than a million, right?
People.
Everybody would be able to be a millionaire in Equatorial Guinea. The country has one of, I think, the highest, GDPs on the continent, per capita income. But 76% of the people live below poverty. You were there a couple of years ago. I mean, you should tell us probably what you saw when you're there. I
mean, you're right on the money. When you are in that country, you don't even think that this is a country that has the highest GDP on the continent. It looks more like a banana republic. Frankly speaking, I don't even know what these guys are doing with the money. They have all this oil money that comes from...
it's a very rich, resource-rich country, not just rich oil, you know.
Yes, they have a lot of minerals, but the wealth of the country is just in the hands of very few people, especially the first family and the people around the first family.
And this is not the first time Mr. Obiang Jr. has been in the news, obviously, in the U.S. His $35 million mansion in Malibu was seized by the FBI a couple of years ago.
That story.
You covered that story.
Yeah, in 2008.
France is probably not able to travel to France and the U.S. Because of pending legal matters.
Related to corruption.
Related to corruption. But it's not just in Equatorial Guinea. We know right now the story is that in Zambia is about to lose out on funding from some of its foreign partners, like the British, because of corruption. Right? You've been in Zambia. You were in Zambia what, a couple of months ago, 2 months ago?
No, last year. Yeah, but what is interesting about that is not just this corruption that we talk about. This is a deep-seated kind of corruption where you don't actually see it, but behind the scenes it's taken over. The Chinese, who are some of the major investors in Zambia, have started seizing properties because the government has failed to pay some of those loans borrowed from China. And one of the reasons they cite is corruption.
Which is very interesting, given that that big whole Africa-China summit just ended, and one of the issues raised is that African leaders are basically selling out the continent, and at some point China will start coming and seizing property, right?
Would that be considered as a neocolonialism by the Chinese?
Yes. But corruption on the continent is something that it's a conversation we talk about every day on Upfront, on Shaka Extra Time. It's not new. Unfortunately, you don't see a lot of goodwill on the part of the leadership to try and fight it. Even those that are trying, say in Kenya, you feel like there's a lot of talk and less action.
But how about people who said that maybe the leadership could be the problem here? Absolutely. Our leaders have failed to fight this fight.
It is the leadership. It is the leadership that enforces the culture of corruption. I mean, look, your home country, Uganda, too. One of one of our readers or followers on Facebook said he called it the corruption capital of Africa. I mean, I don't agree with that. I mean, when you look at Obiang and it puts Uganda to shame in terms of their corruption metrics. But honestly,
100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100% 100%
young people need to wake up on the continent, okay? You need to start demanding that your leadership is accountable in terms of the resources that come in, especially from your natural resources. Where is that money going? And then you start tackling corruption. Also start asking yourself, what is my role in this? Am I also, in a way, enabling corruption by giving bribes, by taking bribes? You know, because corruption is not a one-way street. You know, you take, you give, you know, and somehow that way and it entrenches the culture.
In fact, I was about to ask you something along those lines. You've discussed this issue on Upfront very, very many times, and you talk to a lot of young people. When you talk to these people, what are their concerns? What is it that they tell you about corruption? How can we fight corruption? Are we aiding and abetting it?
Absolutely. You know, actually, many of them don't feel like they're aiding and abetting it because everybody feels a little removed from the situation. All they feel that they're just observers, casual observers of the corruption that is happening. And I told them, stop just discussing about corruption and talking about corruption. Just start asking yourself, what is my role in this? What am I doing on a daily basis? The small things that you do. You know, if you're stopped by a traffic police officer on the street and you decide to give them a bribe than taking the ticket and going to court, then you are abetting corruption. You know, that's the way it starts. I mean, there are other bigger issues like maybe the president taking, you know, money and the son taking money. But let's start from the grassroots, from the ground level, and then you start dealing with it going upwards.
We have a Facebook comment here. Somebody asks a question. He says, is corruption just about stealing money?
No, it's much more than stealing money. Sometimes it's a culture where people feel that they can get away with doing whatever they want. It could be corruption in the judiciary, where you don't feel like the law is, you know, equal. We are all equal in the eyes of the law. There are very different types of corruption. I mean, what we know, what we usually people talk about is the corruption of people taking somebody's money or having to pay a bribe here and there. You know, bribes are synonymous with corruption, but I feel that's wrong. You know, corruption should be seen holistically in terms of what are we doing that is breaking the law. Many of the things that we do that are against the laws of the country, that is corruption. You're corrupting the system.
You are watching Shaka Extra Time. Shaka Sali is out. Jackson Mvonganyi, the host of Upfront, is filling in for Shaka. Just in case you are just joining us, please send us those comments. Let's go to some comments here. Let's go to Fred Kamalilo from Uganda. How can dictators be uprooted without shedding blood? What can be done to promote real democracy in Africa? I mean,
Speak up. Don't be a casual observer. You know, again, I think one of the lessons we're learning from Uganda is that when young people take to the streets, you don't have to take a gun anymore. Like those things of you need to take a gun and then go to fight. Those are things of the past. These days, there are so many things that you can do as a young person to fight to demand for good leadership in your country. You can speak out, you can engage, you can activate, you can mobilize. All these things where you feel like the system is not responding to you, you can speak out. Be part of the process to bring change to your country. Don't wait for Westerners or Western countries. People waiting. You know, we're waiting for America to come and and help us because we're fighting bad leadership. No, America is not coming. Where is your agency as a person who has family of kids in this country? You know, what are you doing on a daily basis to bring change, to demand for change?
But Jackson, how about people who argue that maybe you talked about all these issues, stand up, be counted and all that stuff.
Yes.
Yeah. But these leaders who are in power in most of these countries that are considered quote-unquote undemocratic or the ones that pretend to be democratic, they all came to power by the power of the gun.
Right.
So now you're telling us to stand up, to rise up and be counted, but these guys have guns and we have stones.
One, they will not shoot everybody, that's for sure. Okay. Number two, no change has ever been, no change has ever happened by people just sitting around and talking about it. if you want to see change, be part of the process that brings about change. Now, there's so many ways you can bring about change. You can speak out again. You can mobilize your friends to call and demand leadership. I believe in the power of protest. If that's one way where you're basically telling the leadership that we're not happy with the way things are happening and that we need change. You hold the microscope to power and tell them, we see what is happening. We see you. We need change. We demand change. Now, you're right that most of these governments are not afraid to use weapons of violence against their people. They do control the means of violence, and they're not afraid to use it. We've seen it many times on the streets around the continent where young people are rising and leadership has deployed military forces to, and they're shooting without any concern, taking young people's lives. But again, change will not happen if you don't pay the price. And sometimes it's the ultimate price.
You gave very good examples, and maybe I wanted to go back to a year ago today in Burkina Faso.
Yes.
We saw young people take up the streets. That's a good
example, yes.
Yeah, and we've seen similar examples in Ethiopia. The opposition, especially the Oromia people,
point. Yes.
Taken over the streets.
It wasn't just the Oromia, it was everybody else in Ethiopia. Yes.
And that has led to some kind of significant change in Ethiopia.
The moment of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed coming into power right now and instituting all these changes that we see that everybody's so happy about was brought about by young people going on the streets and demanding change. You remember that the sign they made, where they were on the streets and the way they were dealing with the violence that was being meted out to them was they had to cross their hands to show that we're not armed. The people spoke out. There was a lot of price. There were a lot of people who died in the process. Huge price to pay. But again, I think that's part of the process. That we need to understand that you won't see some of these changes. Some people don't like to see change, mostly those in power, until they see that you are relentless also in asking for the change.
Let's go to another comment here. Let's go to Stella Ruji. Says media freedom is non-existent. What should journalists do amidst all the torture and abuse from security personnel?
That's a good question.
Especially when you look at it from the context of maybe Uganda and your country, Rwanda.
Right. I've seen in the past, I have to commend the media in those countries because they operate in very difficult circumstances. We've seen images and video of that journalist, a friend of yours, who was being beaten on the streets in Kampala just because of covering the protest. We know there's censorship that happens, some of it very subtle. I'm more afraid of situations that lead to self-censorship, where journalists are basically given up on fighting, on speaking out. They're so much afraid that now they start self-censoring. Now, the others, the one we see on the streets, again, that's the price you pay. You are in our field. There's a price to pay. I'll give an example. When I went to cover the Ebola crisis in West Africa a couple of years ago, friends of mine, including some in our profession, were asking me, "Why are you risking your life to go?" I'm like, one, the story needs to be told. Number two, there are people who live in these areas that have not been affected, and I feel like they deserve, even those who have been affected, they deserve their stories to be told to the world. But most importantly, this is the profession that I chose to do, and that I will do it regardless of whatever obstacles I face. And again, I have to give it up for the media practitioners in Uganda and many of these other countries. They fight hard every day. I don't want to take away from that, but keep fighting. America, journalism, media in the world, all over is having a crisis moment at this point. But nobody's, don't sit down, don't sit back, don't wait for help from, and, keep speaking out.
We still have a couple minutes. Let's talk about people power. You had an opportunity to interact and interview Bobby Wine, the Ugandan legislator turned Ugandan pop star turned parliamentarian, Bobby Wine. A lot of people, we have a lot of Facebook comments. They want us to know what was your interaction like, and what do you make of Bobby Wine?
You know, I was very impressed with you know, his ability to articulate the issues on behalf of Ugandan youth. You know, I've known Bobby Wine as a musician for many years, but I was very impressed by his authenticity. Somebody was asking me the other day, like, how is it that everybody's surprised? You know, Bobby Wine surprised the political establishment in Uganda. I'm like, no, you know, actually he's been around. It's just that he has never really waded into, you know, the political waters of the country. It was now that people are just starting to realize he's a political force. I was very impressed by Bobby Wine, and I hope that he continues to speak out on behalf of you know, Ugandan youth. Speak out on behalf of African youth, because he has inspired so many around the continent. You see, when he was jailed and brutalized by the regime, the government does deny. But there were protests by young people in Kenya, in South Africa, in the US here, right outside the White House, and many other places. So his ability, first of all, to mobilize young people using his music and his messaging is just impeccable, and so I really hope that he can continue with his work.
Do you think that his slogan, people power, is sustainable?
Absolutely. I think when we had him on the show, he said that part of the reason why they're calling it people power is so that the movement, at no point should they call it a Bobby Wine movement. You know, and I like that about him, because, you know, usually we see these leaders coming into power and we have all struggled to create change, and then this one guy who was the leader basically takes ownership of the struggle, takes all the credit for having created the change. And Bobby Wine is very remarkable in giving credit to everybody. In every media interview he has had here in the US and in Uganda, he always talks about giving credit to everybody else, not just him as Bobby Wine, as an individual. And I feel like when we get out of this business of crediting characters or people or individuals for having created the change, then that's where we have the strong men of the future, you know.
So tomorrow on Straight Talk Africa, we are talking about capacity building in Africa. We are going to be looking at maybe science and technology, innovation, science and technology. You've covered that area. What do you think is critical when it comes to building capacity on the continent?
You know, it is very necessary that we see some sort of educational reform happening on the continent very soon, very, very soon. We see, for example, we were talking earlier before we came, you know, South Africa is going to institute Swahili in their schools I think in 2020. That is part of their process to reform their education system to reflect the needs and the desires and the issues that affect people on the daily life. Okay, the education system on the continent right now is a remnant of you know, our colonial masters and the books that they left behind, the system they left behind. It has nothing to do with what is happening. So you have a lot of kids who have gone to school, they go to university, they come out there on the streets. So if we don't reform the education system, we're always going to be in that same very circle. You know, you have professionals who are not really, don't have an understanding of what the issues are on the ground, how to solve very simple, basic problems in their communities.
Well, Jackson, on that note, thank you so much for being a great guest. I look forward to hosting you on another edition. I don't know when, but soon.
Thank you, Paul.
It was a pleasure having you over.
Thank you, Paul. I'm glad.
Thank you for filling in for Shaka.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
To you, all our viewers, thank you, and thank you for watching us. Shaka Extra Time is a place where you get to talk to Shaka. Next week, Shaka will be here, so stay tuned for more. Thank you.
pro-choice